The patriarch who kept his daughter and granddaughter as wives remained hidden in the mist-shrouded valleys of the Appalachian Mountains for decades, a story so disturbing that locals spoke of it only in whispers. In the isolated hollows of eastern Kentucky, where dirt roads wind through dense forests and outsiders rarely ventured, the Blackwood family lived removed from society's watchful eyes for generations. The year was 1937 when Jeremiah Blackwood, a coal miner turned moonshiner after the Great Depression ravaged the region's economy, established his homestead deep in Copperhead Hollow. Standing 6 feet tall with weathered skin and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them, Jeremiah commanded respect through fear. His reputation for violence preceded him, and few dared to challenge his authority in the secluded community. The Blackwood property sprawled across 50 acres of rugged terrain, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that became impassable during heavy rains. A dilapidated 2-story farmhouse stood at the center, surrounded by smaller outbuildings, a smokehouse, and cornfields that provided sustenance and the raw materials for Jeremiah's lucrative moonshine operation. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away, and the closest town, Pikeville, required a full day's journey. Jeremiah had married young to Sarah Collins, a quiet, docile woman from a neighboring hollow. By 1937, they had 7 children, with their eldest daughter Martha being 16. Sarah died during the birth of their 8th child in 1938, leaving Jeremiah to raise his large family alone in the isolated homestead. The family's remoteness and self-sufficiency meant that the children rarely attended school or interacted with outsiders. As winter descended upon the hollow in 1939, Martha disappeared from public view. When questioned by rare visitors, Jeremiah explained that she had gone to live with relatives in Virginia. In truth, Martha never left Copperhead Hollow. According to later testimonies from younger Blackwood children, Jeremiah had begun to view his daughter differently after Sarah's death. Martha, bearing a striking resemblance to her mother, became the focus of Jeremiah's inappropriate attention. Historian Dr. Eleanor Wilson, who documented Appalachian family structures in the early 20th century, explains, isolation combined with patriarchal authority created dangerous dynamics in some mountain communities. Without external social constraints or education about genetic relationships, some families developed closed systems where the patriarch's word became absolute law. By 1941, Martha gave birth to a daughter named Ruth, though no husband was ever introduced to the community. The few neighbors who occasionally traded with the Blackwoods noticed Martha's changed status. She now occupied the role of household matriarch, cooking, cleaning, and caring for her siblings. But most disturbing were the bruises often visible on her arms and face, and her downcast eyes whenever Jeremiah was present. Local storekeeper William Jenkins later recalled, something wasn't right with that family. Martha used to be such a lively girl, always smiling when they'd come to town for supplies. Then she just stopped coming altogether. When I finally saw her again years later, she was like a different person, hollow-eyed and silent. The true nature of the relationship remained hidden from authorities, protected by mountain isolation and a culture of non-interference in family matters. In these communities, family business stayed within family boundaries, and outside intervention was viewed with suspicion and hostility. Throughout the 1940s, Jeremiah's illegal moonshine operation flourished, bringing occasional prosperity to the family but also increasing their isolation as Jeremiah grew more paranoid about revenue agents discovering his still. The children were taught to be vigilant against strangers and to alert Jeremiah if anyone approached their property. Ruth grew up believing Jeremiah was her father, unaware of the disturbing truth of her parentage. She was kept from school and rarely allowed to leave the property. By age 13 in 1954, Ruth had become a beautiful young woman with the same striking blue eyes as Jeremiah and Martha. It was then that the family's dark secret deepened even further. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You don't want to miss our upcoming investigations that expose society's darkest hidden truths that mainstream media won't touch. Subscribe now to join our community of truth seekers. The early 1950s brought subtle changes to the isolated regions of Appalachia. While the post-war economic boom transformed much of America, these hidden hollers remained largely untouched by progress. Electricity had not yet reached Copperhead Hollow, and the Blackwood family continued to live much as they had for decades, by kerosene lamp, wood stove, and the rhythm of seasons. By 1954, the Blackwood homestead had deteriorated further. The white paint had long since peeled from the clapboard siding, leaving the house a weathered gray. The roof leaked during heavy rains, and the porch sagged dangerously on one side. Yet Jeremiah, now in his 50s with streaks of gray in his dark hair, maintained tight control over his domain. Martha, at 31, appeared much older. Years of hardship and mistreatment had left her gaunt and prematurely aged. Her once vibrant auburn hair had dulled, and deep lines etched her face. She moved through the house like a ghost, performing her duties mechanically while avoiding direct interaction with Jeremiah whenever possible. Ruth, however, blossomed despite the harsh conditions. Tall and slender, with long chestnut hair and curious eyes, she possessed a natural intelligence that allowed her to teach herself to read from the few tattered books in the house. She dreamed of a world beyond the hollow, gleaned from occasional radio broadcasts when the family's battery-powered radio worked. In summer 1954, Jeremiah's behavior toward Ruth began to change. Martha noticed the shift immediately: the lingering glances, the unnecessary touching, the same patterns that had preceded her own nightmare 13 years earlier. Desperate to protect her daughter, Martha attempted to send Ruth away to her younger sister, who had married and moved to Cincinnati. "I found letters hidden in a flour tin," recounted Emma Blackwood, Martha's younger sister, decades later. "Martha was begging me to take Ruth, saying there was danger at home. I didn't understand then what she meant, but I wrote back agreeing to help." That letter never reached Martha. Jeremiah intercepted the correspondence and flew into a rage. The beating Martha received that night was witnessed by several of the younger children, who later described it in horrified detail to authorities. The next morning, Martha was confined to the root cellar for 3 days without food, emerging broken in body and spirit. By winter, Ruth had replaced Martha in Jeremiah's disturbing attentions. The terrible cycle of generational inappropriate relationships continued, hidden behind the walls of the isolated farmhouse. Martha, powerless to prevent what was happening, retreated further into herself, finding solace only in caring for her younger children. Dr. Robert Campbell, geneticist at Appalachian State University, explains the scientific concerns of such relationships. Close family relationships dramatically increase the risk of recessive genetic disorders. When related individuals have children, the chance of both parents carrying the same harmful recessive genes increases significantly, potentially leading to serious health conditions in offspring. In 1956, at age 15, Ruth gave birth to a son with severe developmental issues. The infant, named Elijah, had distinctive physical abnormalities: a misshapen skull, webbed fingers, and respiratory difficulties. He survived only 3 months, dying during a harsh winter storm when the family couldn't reach medical help. The infant was buried in the small family cemetery on the property, another secret hidden among the pines. Ruth was devastated by the loss, while Jeremiah showed little emotion. For Martha, the child's passing represented both heartbreak and relief. Heartbreak at the innocent life lost, relief that the child would not suffer a lifetime of difficulties. Following Elijah's death, Ruth withdrew into herself, much as her mother had years before. The once curious, bright-eyed girl became silent and submissive. The relationship between mother and daughter grew closer in their shared trauma, though they rarely spoke directly about their circumstances. Words were unnecessary. Each understood the other's pain implicitly. In 1957, the outside world briefly intruded on the Blackwood isolation when a public health nurse named Dorothy Chambers attempted to visit rural families to administer polio vaccinations to children. When she arrived at the Blackwood property, Jeremiah met her with a shotgun at the property line, refusing to allow her access and denying he had any school-aged children. Chambers later reported her concerns to the county sheriff, but with limited resources and no specific evidence of wrongdoing, no action was taken. Many families in those hills were suspicious of government officials, Sheriff James Taylor noted in his reports. Without clear proof of criminal activity, we couldn't justify forcing our way onto private property. By 1958, Ruth was pregnant again. This second pregnancy progressed with difficulty, with Ruth suffering from severe anemia and high blood pressure. Martha, drawing on folk remedies and her experience with 7 siblings, did her best to care for her daughter, but both women feared the outcome given the previous birth's complications. The bitter winter of 1958 brought record snowfall to eastern Kentucky, isolating Copperhead Hollow even more completely than usual. In December, Ruth went into labor 2 months early. With no medical assistance available, Martha served as midwife in the flickering light of kerosene lamps while a blizzard howled outside. After 18 hours of labor, Ruth delivered a daughter, Elizabeth, who weighed less than 4 pounds. The infant struggled to breathe, her tiny lips taking on a bluish tinge in the dim light. Martha, drawing on generations of mountain knowledge, fashioned a primitive incubator from a wooden drawer lined with heated bricks wrapped in blankets. Against all odds, Elizabeth survived her precarious first weeks. However, as she developed, it became apparent that she suffered from multiple health issues. Her left eye remained partially closed, her spine curved noticeably, and one leg was significantly shorter than the other. Most concerning was her heart murmur, audible even without medical instruments when she exerted herself. Genetic disorders resulting from consanguinity often affect multiple systems in the body, explains Dr. Emily Richards, pediatric geneticist. Cardiovascular malformations, skeletal abnormalities, and intellectual disabilities are commonly observed in children born from close family relationships, particularly when such relationships occur across generations. Despite her physical challenges, Elizabeth displayed remarkable resilience and intelligence. By age 2, she spoke in complete sentences and showed a gift for remembering stories told to her by Martha. Ruth devoted herself entirely to Elizabeth's care, finding purpose in protecting her daughter in ways she herself had never been protected. Jeremiah, now approaching 60, had little interest in the sickly child. His moonshine business had declined with increased law enforcement presence in the region, and he spent most days hunting or sitting on the porch with his rifle across his knees, suspicious of any vehicle that passed on the distant road. In spring 1961, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Blackwood property, Richard Collins, Sarah's younger brother and Martha's uncle. Having spent decades working in Detroit's automobile factories, Richard had recently retired and returned to Kentucky to reconnect with family members. He had lost touch with his sister's family after her death and was shocked by the conditions he found at the homestead. The place was barely standing, Richard later testified. Children in ragged clothes, the house filthy, and Martha, I hardly recognized my own niece. She looked 20 years older than she was. And when I realized that young Ruth was both Martha's daughter and Jeremiah's, and that little Elizabeth was born of the same terrible situation, I knew I had to do something. Richard's visit lasted only a few hours before Jeremiah ordered him off the property at gunpoint. Disturbed by what he'd witnessed, Richard drove directly to the county sheriff's office in Pikeville to report his suspicions. This time, with a credible witness and specific allegations, Sheriff Taylor could no longer ignore the situation at Copperhead Hollow. If you've ever wondered how such horrific situations can remain hidden for so long, type Society failed these victims in the comments below. Your voice matters in bringing attention to these overlooked tragedies. On April 17, 1961, Sheriff Taylor led a team of deputies and a social worker named Grace Peterson to the Blackwood property. What they discovered would shock even these experienced law enforcement officers, familiar with the hardships of mountain life. 6 children ranging in age from 7 to 17 were found in varying states of neglect. Martha, now 38 but appearing much older, initially denied any inappropriate relationships but broke down when questioned separately from Jeremiah. Ruth, clutching 3-year-old Elizabeth, refused to speak at all, trembling violently whenever Jeremiah looked in her direction. The most damning evidence came from Jeremiah's own records, a family Bible in which he had meticulously documented births, listing himself as father to both Martha's and Ruth's children. This written confession, combined with testimony from the younger children who had witnessed the family dynamics, provided authorities with enough evidence to arrest Jeremiah on multiple charges. As deputies led Jeremiah from the property in handcuffs, he showed no remorse, shouting that outsiders had no right to interfere in his family affairs. The Mountain Code of Family Sovereignty, twisted to serve his disturbing purposes, remained his only moral framework until the end. The younger children were placed in foster homes while Martha, Ruth, and Elizabeth were taken to Pikeville Medical Center for examination and treatment. Doctors documented decades of physical trauma to both women and confirmed Elizabeth's numerous health conditions, recommending immediate intervention for her heart condition. News of the Blackwood case sent shockwaves through eastern Kentucky, while rumors of isolated families with unusual practices had circulated for generations. The reality of what had occurred in Copperhead Hollow forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about the darker consequences of extreme isolation and patriarchal authority. The trial of Jeremiah Blackwood began in September 1961, drawing unprecedented attention to the small courthouse in Pikeville. Reporters from Louisville and even national publications descended on the mountain town, though the judge restricted media access to protect the victim's privacy. County Prosecutor William Harrison presented a methodical case introducing medical evidence, the family Bible records, and testimony from neighbors and relatives who had witnessed aspects of the Blackwood family dynamics over the decades. Most powerful was Richard Collins' account of his visit that had finally triggered intervention. Martha, finding courage she didn't know she possessed, took the stand on the third day of the trial. Speaking in a quiet voice that nonetheless carried through the silent courtroom, she recounted 22 years of mistreatment beginning when she was just 16. Many jurors openly wept as she described the birth of Ruth and her failed attempts to protect her daughter from suffering the same fate. "There wasn't a dry eye in that courtroom," recalled court clerk Mildred Simmons years later, "to hear what that woman endured, how she tried to shield her child despite her own suffering. It was the most heartbreaking testimony I witnessed in 40 years working for the court." Ruth, still severely traumatized, was deemed psychologically unable to testify. Instead, her written statement was read into evidence by Grace Peterson, the social worker who had been working closely with Ruth and Elizabeth since their rescue. The statement detailed Ruth's confusion and pain, believing for years that her situation was normal until she began to understand the truth as a young teenager. Jeremiah's court-appointed attorney, Thomas Weller, attempted to argue that his client was a product of isolation and ignorance rather than malice, suggesting that generations of mountain life had created different standards of behavior. This defense strategy backfired dramatically, offending the largely Appalachian jury who resented the implication that mountain people accepted such behavior. On September 30th, 1961, after just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Jeremiah guilty on all counts. Judge Harold Combs, a lifelong resident of eastern Kentucky, delivered a scathing condemnation before sentencing. "Mr. Blackwood, you have perverted the sacred trust of fatherhood and used isolation not as the traditional mountain value of self-reliance, but as a weapon to conceal unimaginable cruelty. Your actions have nothing to do with our mountain heritage and everything to do with the worst aspects of human nature. I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole," as Jeremiah was led from the courtroom to begin his sentence at Kentucky State Penitentiary. A new chapter began for the survivors of Copperhead Hollow. With the help of social services and support from church groups, Martha, Ruth, and Elizabeth relocated to a small house on the outskirts of Pikeville, beginning the long process of healing and adaptation to a world they had been denied for so long. The challenges were immense. Neither woman had formal education beyond elementary school. Both struggled with trust, physical health issues from years of neglect, and the psychological aftermath of trauma. Elizabeth, now 4, required multiple surgeries to address her heart condition and orthopedic issues. Dr. Margaret Wilson, a psychologist who worked with the family, noted in her case files, "The resilience demonstrated by these individuals is remarkable. Despite enduring circumstances that would break most people, both Martha and Ruth show extraordinary determination to create a better life for Elizabeth. Their bond, forged in shared suffering, now serves as their greatest strength in recovery." Martha found employment as a seamstress at a local dry cleaning shop, her deft fingers recalling the skills taught by her mother before tragedy altered her life's course. Ruth, once she gained confidence, discovered a talent for storytelling, eventually working as a classroom aide at the elementary school where Elizabeth enrolled. Elizabeth, despite her physical challenges, thrived in school. Her intelligence and determination impressed teachers, and with proper medical intervention, many of her health issues improved. Though she would always walk with a limp and require cardiac monitoring, she developed into a bright, compassionate child who became an advocate for other children with disabilities. In 1967, 6 years after their rescue, the family reached a significant milestone when Ruth earned her GED, the first formal educational credential in the family's history. The local newspaper ran a small story about her achievement, noting that she planned to pursue nursing studies at the community college, a path chosen from her desire to help others as she and Elizabeth had been helped. Jeremiah Blackwood died in prison in 1973, having never expressed remorse or requested contact with his family. When notified of his death, Martha simply nodded and returned to her sewing, while Ruth took Elizabeth for a long walk in the park. No family member attended his prison burial. The Blackwood case, though sensational at the time, gradually faded from public memory. However, for social service professionals and law enforcement in Appalachia, it became an important reference point that prompted changes in how isolated families were monitored and supported. By the mid-1970s, the Blackwood women had established a new identity far removed from their painful past. Martha, approaching her 50s but finally looking her actual age as proper nutrition and reduced stress allowed her body to recover, had become a respected member of her church community, quietly mentoring younger women facing difficulties. Ruth, at 35, completed her nursing degree and worked at Pikeville Medical Center in the pediatric unit, her gentle manner and infinite patience making her particularly effective with frightened children. Though she never married, she built a fulfilling life centered around her career, her mother, and her daughter. Elizabeth, now a teenager, excelled academically despite ongoing health challenges. Intelligent and determined, she developed an interest in genetics after learning about her own background, beginning to understand the scientific factors behind her health issues. In 1976, Dr. Lawrence Jenkins, a sociologist studying isolated Appalachian communities, approached the family about including their anonymized story in his research. After careful consideration, Martha and Ruth agreed, recognizing that their experience, though painful, could help prevent similar situations and combat stereotypes about Appalachian family structures. The Blackwood case represents an extreme aberration, not a cultural norm, Dr. Jenkins emphasized in his published work. It's crucial to understand that such isolated instances occur precisely because they deviate so dramatically from accepted community standards. When they are discovered, mountain communities react with the same horror and condemnation as any other society, the study highlighted. How extreme isolation, poverty, and lack of education created conditions where abuse could continue undetected, while emphasizing that such cases were exceedingly rare and uniformly condemned when discovered. It also documented the remarkable resilience shown by survivors when provided with appropriate support and opportunities. In 1979, Elizabeth graduated as valedictorian of her high school class, delivering a powerful speech about overcoming obstacles that moved many in attendance to tears. Though she never publicly discussed her origins, her understanding of genetics and hereditary conditions influenced her decision to study medicine, specifically genetic counseling. "I want to help families understand their genetic heritage and make informed decisions," she explained to Ruth when discussing her college plans. "Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to breaking cycles of disease or difficulty." Elizabeth's career choice represented the ultimate transformation of darkness into light, using the circumstances of her birth not as a source of shame, but as motivation to prevent suffering in others. She would go on to become a prominent genetic counselor, working particularly with rural and underserved populations. Martha passed away in 1988 at age 65, having lived to see Elizabeth graduate from college and begin her graduate studies. Her funeral was attended by dozens of community members whose lives she had quietly touched in her later years. Ruth, in her eulogy, spoke of her mother's unbreakable spirit and how she had ultimately triumphed over circumstances that would have destroyed a lesser person. The Blackwood case, though extraordinary in its severity, illuminated broader issues that continued to challenge Appalachian communities into the late 20th century, the double-edged sword of isolation, the consequences of limited educational and economic opportunities, and the critical importance of accessible social services and healthcare. In 1990, Elizabeth established the Mountain Genetics Education Initiative, a nonprofit organization providing information about genetic health to isolated communities. The program combined medical outreach with respect for Appalachian cultural values, offering services in a non-judgmental framework that honored mountain traditions while providing modern scientific knowledge. "We're not here to criticize or change mountain culture," Elizabeth explained at the program's launch. "We're here to ensure that all families have access to information that can help them make healthy choices while preserving the positive aspects of their heritage, the strong family bonds, self-reliance, and community support that have always been the true hallmarks of Appalachian life." By the early 2000s, the program had reached thousands of families across Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee, though few knew the personal motivation behind Elizabeth's work. Her combination of scientific expertise and cultural sensitivity made the initiative particularly effective in communities traditionally suspicious of outside intervention. Ruth remained in Pikeville until her death in 2012, a respected elder in the community who had transformed her suffering into service. In her personal journals discovered after her passing, she reflected on the journey from Copperhead Hollow to a life of meaning and purpose. "The hollow tried to swallow us, but we found our way to the light. Mother showed me how to survive. I taught Elizabeth how to thrive." 3 generations of women bound by blood and pain, who finally broke the chains that held us. This is our true legacy, not the darkness we endured, but the light we finally found. The Blackwood women's story represents both a cautionary tale and a testament to human resilience. It reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, the capacity for healing and transformation remains, particularly when communities provide support rather than judgment. If you've watched until this point, it's because you care about these hidden histories. Leave a comment saying "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and understand who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. These untold histories deserve to be remembered. Like and share this video to help others understand the complex realities that shaped our nation's hidden corners. Together we can ensure that the lessons of the past inform a more compassionate future.